The snow outside painted everything white. Fences, rooftops, even the old mailbox that hadn't seen a letter in months. I stood at the doorstep, clutching a small box of apple pie I'd baked that morning, pretending the cold in my hands was the only thing that hurt. Inside, laughter echoed, the kind that feels rehearsed. Rachel was setting the table, her movements too graceful, too deliberate. My son, Ben, kept his eyes down as he stirred the sauce, as if avoiding something heavier than the pan in his hand. "Mom, you're here," he said, his smile warm but strained. I smiled back, unaware that this dinner wasn't about family. It was about trust, and how easily it can be signed away. What would you do if your own child's dinner invitation turned out to be a trap? Tell me in the comments. Would you forgive, or would you fight back? And before I continue, make sure you're subscribed to Her Rebirth Path. Because this isn't just a story about family. It's about the moment truth walks in. Snow drifted quietly over the rooftops as Margaret Miller tightened her scarf and stepped from her car. The world was wrapped in white and silence, that kind of stillness that makes even a whisper feel too loud. Her son Ben had called that afternoon, his voice soft but careful. "Just dinner, Mom. A simple family meal." It had been months since they'd spoken properly. Margaret missed him, though she'd never admit how much. She told herself this dinner might be the small bridge they both needed. Rachel opened the door before she could knock. "Margaret, you came," she said, smiling too brightly. Warm air poured from the house, carrying the scent of roasted meat and something too sweet, like perfume trying to hide a bad smell. Inside, candles flickered over a table set a little too perfectly. Rachel's laughter filled the space, but Ben's silence echoed louder. He barely looked up as he stirred his soup, his shoulders tense. Margaret tried to ease the air with small talk, yet the smiles felt thin as paper. Rachel poured wine into her glass. "To family," she said, her tone sweet but sharp at the edges. Margaret raised the glass, but didn't drink much. "It's lovely," she said softly, though the wine tasted bitter on her tongue. On the table beside the roast and the golden potatoes lay a red folder. "What's this?" she asked lightly. Rachel's eyes flicked toward it too quickly. "Just some bank papers. Boring stuff," she replied, waving her hand as if to brush the moment away. Margaret nodded, but something inside her tightened. Years as a judge had trained her to read more from what people avoided saying. Ben still wouldn't meet her eyes. His fork moved without appetite. The room felt warmer, heavier. Rachel poured another glass. "You know, Margaret," she said, leaning closer, "we've been helping with some of your bills, the utilities, the taxes. Ben thought it might be easier if everything were handled together. We could sort it tonight." Margaret smiled politely. "That's thoughtful." Her hand brushed the edge of the red folder. It was warm, as if it had been waiting. Outside, wind rattled the window pane. The house felt strangely quiet. For the first time, Margaret felt the dinner wasn't about family at all. When she looked up, Rachel was watching her, not with kindness, but with expectation. The scent of cinnamon and coffee drifted from the kitchen, mingling with the faint crackle of the fireplace. Margaret rose from her chair, brushing a crumb from her lap. "Let me help with dessert," she said softly. Rachel's voice floated back, cheerful and thin. "No need, Margaret, I've got it." Still, old habits urged her to follow. She'd spent years caring for others, in her courtroom, in her home, in every silence that followed Ben's father's death. Helping felt natural. But when she reached the doorway, something in her stilled. Through the half-open door, voices tangled like frost in the wind. "Rachel, stop." Ben's voice broke the quiet, low, desperate. "I'm not agreeing to this. You can't get her drunk just to make her sign." Rachel's tone cut clean through the warmth of the house. "She'll never sign if she's sober, Ben. You know that. But once she does, we're free. No more bills, no more worrying about money." "Free?" Ben's laugh trembled. "By lying to my own mother?" A pause, then the sound of glass tipping, the sharp shatter of wine spilling across the floor. "Enough," Ben said. "You don't understand." Rachel's voice cracked, a mix of anger and fear. "You've worked for years, and what do you have to show for it? She's sitting on everything we could ever need. Just tonight, Ben. One night, and we start over." Margaret stood frozen, her hand resting on the frame. The candlelight from the dining room danced over the edge of the red folder. For a heartbeat, she could almost hear the echo of her years in the courtroom. The trembling voices, the confessions, the moments before truth changed everything. Outside, the wind howled against the window. Inside, the air was just as cold. Rachel whispered again, lower this time. "She won't even remember. I'll pour one more glass, and you'll thank me when it's done." Margaret's pulse hammered in her chest. She knew that tone, the calm of someone who'd already crossed the line. The spoon she held slipped from her fingers, landing softly on the rug. Neither of them heard it. She stepped back slowly, her breath shallow. Her son's voice, broken but firm, was the last thing she heard before the world outside roared with wind. "Then I'll stop you, Rachel." And that was when Margaret knew. This was no family dinner. It was a battlefield. And she was standing at its door. The kitchen was a painting of chaos. The soft light of the chandelier trembling over wine stains, half-cooked dishes, and a storm brewing between two hearts that once promised forever. Rachel's hand gripped the wine bottle so tightly, her knuckles turned white. Her voice cracked the silence. "You're weak, Ben. Always running to your mother like a scared little boy." Ben stood his ground, chest rising and falling in uneven breaths. "This isn't about taking sides," he said quietly. "It's about doing what's right." Rachel laughed, a hollow, sharp sound that made Margaret's heart clench from where she stood by the doorway. "Right?" Rachel sneered. "Right is what gets us broke, Ben. Your mother has everything, and she looks at us like beggars in her palace." Ben tried to reach for the bottle, to calm her, but Rachel yanked it away. "Don't you dare pity me," she spat. He stepped closer. "I don't pity you. I love you. But I won't let you hurt her." Something flickered in Rachel's eyes. Anger, pride, fear. And then it boiled over. In one swift motion, she slammed the bottle on the counter and grabbed the cast iron skillet from the stove, its handle still hot from the fire. "Rachel, stop!" But fury had deafened her. She swung the pan toward him, a flash of steel and desperation. And that was when Margaret moved. Years of instinct, from mother, from judge, from survivor, surged through her body. She lunged forward, pulling Ben out of the way just as the skillet smashed into the edge of the table. The clang echoed through the house, cold and final. Rachel froze. The pan slipped from her trembling hands, landing with a dull thud on the tile floor. Her face paled as the last of her rage drained away, leaving only silence. Margaret's heart pounded against her ribs. She looked at her son, his cheek flushed, his breath ragged. And something inside her cracked, softer but deeper than fear. The air smelled of burnt butter and regret. The sound of the wind pressed against the window like the world itself was holding its breath. Rachel backed away, whispering, "You'll regret this." Before running down the hall, The front door slammed shut behind her, scattering the night's fragile peace. Margaret sank into a chair, hands shaking. The red folder still sat on the counter, untouched. But the truth no longer needed ink to be written. Outside, the snow kept falling. And Margaret knew that before morning came, she'd have to make a call, not to family, but to the police. The house was silent except for the ticking of the old wall clock. A sound so steady, it made the night feel endless. Margaret sat at the kitchen table, her hands resting on the red folder Rachel had left behind. Ben stood near the window, shoulders hunched, eyes glistening under the dim light. "I never wanted it to go this far," he whispered. She said, "If you didn't sign, she'd leave me." His voice cracked, carrying both shame and love, twisted into something fragile. Margaret looked at her son, the same boy who used to leave her little drawings on her desk when she worked late nights in court. "And you believed her?" she asked softly, not with anger, but with a grief too deep for words. He nodded, unable to meet her eyes. With slow, deliberate hands, Margaret opened the folder. Inside was no bank paperwork, as Rachel had claimed, but a carefully typed document, a full transfer of property, savings, and investments. Every word was legal, precise, and poison. The light caught on the signature line, already marked with a faint trace of ink, her name forged in careful strokes. Her breath caught. "She copied my signature." Ben's voice trembled. "I think she practiced. I saw her looking at your letters last week, but I didn't think." Margaret closed her eyes. For a long moment, she said nothing. The scent of wine still lingered in the air, and on the tablecloth, a dark red stain spread like a wound that wouldn't dry. "This isn't just betrayal," she finally said, her voice quiet but solid as stone. "It's a crime." Ben sank into the chair across from her, burying his face in his hands. "What do we do now?" Margaret straightened, the calm of years on the bench returning to her bones. "We do what's right. We gather evidence. We call the police. And we make sure she never hurts you or anyone again." Outside, the wind had softened, but the air carried the chill of something ending. Margaret reached for her phone, her fingers steady now. She had been a judge for decades. She knew the weight of law and mercy. But tonight, she was something stronger, not just a mother, a protector. The morning light crept softly through the curtains, pale and cold as a confession. Margaret hadn't slept. The phone lay beside her, silent now, but her mind still echoed with Ben's trembling voice from the night before. The betrayal had burned through her like frost on glass, leaving clarity where love once blurred the lines. She poured herself a cup of black coffee, steadying her hands before dialing a number she hadn't called in years. "Rick?" she said when the line clicked. A deep, familiar voice replied, warm with memory. "Ellie Miller. It's been too long. What kind of trouble brings you back to me?" "Not trouble," she said softly. "Justice." Rick had been a detective before retiring, one of the few who'd stood beside her through the most painful cases. When she explained the situation, his tone shifted, professional once more. "Send me her full name, date of birth, and anything you have on her finances. I'll dig." Hours later, the sky turned silver with falling snow when her phone buzzed again. "Margaret, you might want to sit down for this," Rick began. "Rachel's in deep debt, close to $400,000. She was fired 2 years ago for falsifying records at her firm. She's been using Ben's name to open credit lines. And that's not all." Margaret gripped the edge of her table. "There's more?" Rick sighed. She's been looking into property laws, inheritance rights. If anything happened to you, she'd get the house automatically through Ben. She wasn't planning to wait long. Silence filled the room. Only the clock ticked, slow, merciless. For a moment, Margaret felt her chest tighten with something more painful than anger. Sorrow. Not for herself, but for Ben, who had loved a woman that saw him as a doorway to wealth. "Rick," she whispered, her voice trembling but firming with each word. "Thank you. We'll do this the right way." "You always did," he replied softly. When the call ended, she looked around the quiet kitchen. The red folder still sat on the counter, its presence heavy and accusing. Margaret stood, straightened her shoulders, and took a deep breath. The law she once served in court had come home, and this time it wasn't in her hands as a judge. It was in her heart as a mother. Outside, the snow began to fall again, quiet, relentless, like justice finding its way home. The courtroom was quiet, the kind of silence that carries the weight of truth. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, dust floating like fragments of memory. Margaret sat in the front row, her hands clasped, her posture steady though her heart trembled beneath her coat. Rachel stood at the defendant's table, her once perfect hair pulled back too tightly, her eyes ringed with sleeplessness. The arrogance that once filled her voice was gone, replaced by the brittle calm of someone watching their own walls crumble. Ben sat behind her, unable to look up. His hands twisted the edge of his sleeve, guilt heavy on his shoulders. The prosecutor's voice echoed through the room. "Your Honor, the defendant forged signatures, opened fraudulent accounts, and attempted to coerce a senior citizen into signing over her estate. The evidence is clear." Rachel's lawyer muttered something about stress, desperation, and misunderstanding, but the words fell flat. No one in that room believed in accidents anymore. When the judge turned to Margaret, asking if she wished to speak, the room seemed to hold its breath. She rose slowly, her years on the bench reflected in her calm. "Justice," she began, her voice steady and low, "is not about revenge. It's about protecting what love built." Every word carried warmth and gravity, the quiet authority of a mother who had seen both cruelty and grace. "My son was misled. My trust was broken. But I will not let anger decide what law should heal." Even the judge paused for a moment before nodding. "Thank you, Mrs. Miller." The verdict came soon after. Rachel was sentenced to probation and financial restitution, with a restraining order preventing her from contacting Margaret or Ben again. For a moment, the world felt still. Then, Rachel's shoulders shook. Tears streamed down her face, dark mascara staining the paper in her hands. But Margaret could see. Those were not tears of remorse. They were the bitter salt of defeat. Ben finally lifted his gaze to meet his mother's. The look between them said everything. Sorrow, forgiveness, and the fragile start of rebuilding what had been nearly lost. As the gavel struck, the sound echoed like a closing door, not of punishment, but of release. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and slow, as if the world itself was ready to forgive. Margaret stepped into the cold morning air, breathing deeply. For the first time in months, the weight on her chest began to lift. But she knew healing, like justice, would take time. The world had softened. The snow that once buried the garden was gone, replaced by a quiet sea of green. Tulips bloomed around the porch, yellow, pink, and white, their petals trembling gently in the morning breeze. Margaret stood by the window with a cup of tea, watching her son paint the old fence. The air smelled of wet earth and beginnings. It had been months since the trial. Months since the night the truth tore through their family like a storm. Now, peace came not as joy, but as quiet forgiveness. Ben turned, his face speckled with blue paint, and smiled. "You know," he said, "this place doesn't feel so empty anymore." Margaret smiled back. "Because you came home," she answered simply. The house was alive again. The laughter of 2 generations replaced the echoes of fear. Together, they painted the old walls a soft sky blue, the color of healing, of calm after chaos. Every brushstroke seemed to erase a little more of the past. Ben had found work at a financial counseling center for victims of fraud, a place that gave him purpose again. "If people like Rachel could learn how money breaks hearts," he once told her, "maybe fewer families would have to go through what we did." Margaret nodded proudly, seeing the man her son had become, not broken, not bitter, but wiser. She herself began volunteering at the local senior center, teaching elderly citizens how to recognize financial scams and understand their rights. The law she once served from the bench had returned to her hands, not as authority, but as compassion. One evening, as the sunset painted the kitchen in gold, Ben brought out a small crystal glass, the same one that had shattered during that terrible night. It was now fused together with thin lines of gold, shimmering like veins of sunlight. "Kintsugi," Ben said softly. "The Japanese art of mending what's broken." Margaret touched the repaired glass gently, tears welling in her eyes. "You know," she whispered, "the places that once broke are the places where light finds its way in." They placed the glass on the shelf beside the tulips, where the morning light could reach it. And as the wind carried the scent of spring through the open window, the house, once heavy with silence, finally breathed again. Sometimes life breaks us in ways we never expect, through betrayal, loss, or silence. But just like the glass mended with gold, our cracks are not proof of failure. They are proof that we have survived. Margaret and Ben found healing not in revenge, but in grace, a quiet reminder that even in our worst winters, God's hand is never far away. Every dawn, every act of forgiveness is a small miracle. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment, subscribe, and help us spread more stories that remind the world kindness still wins. May God bless you, and may His light find its way into your home.